In 1704, a Scottish sailor looked his captain in the eye and said he'd rather be abandoned on a deserted island than continue sailing on their rotting ship. The captain laughed, granted his wish, and sailed away. Within months, that ship was at the bottom of the ocean. 45 of the 63 men aboard were dead. But even the survivors were tortured in a Spanish prison. The man left behind on that island? He lived. But here's the part the mainstream story leaves out. Alexander Selkirk wasn't gambling blindly. He'd heard the stories. He knew that 20 years earlier, another man, a Mosquito Indian named Will, had survived alone on that exact same island for 3 years. Almost nobody remembers Will today, but Selkirk did, and that knowledge may have been the difference between a death wish and a calculated risk. This is the true story of the man who inspired Robinson Crusoe, and everything Daniel Defoe didn't tell you. To understand why Selkirk made that choice, you have to understand who he was. And honestly, he was kind of a disaster. Born in 1676 in Lower Largo, a small fishing village on the Scottish coast, Alexander was the 7th son of a shoemaker and tanner named John Selcraig. That's right, Selcraig. The name Selkirk came later. Some historians think he changed it deliberately to distance himself from his past. And when you look at that past, you can see why he might have wanted to. At 13 years old, young Alexander joined a mob, led by his own brother, that physically blocked their local minister from entering the church. They were brandishing clubs and forced the pastor to share the proceeds of the poor box with them. This wasn't youthful mischief. It was organized intimidation. A few years later, he was summoned before the Kirk Session, basically the local church court, for indecent conduct during a service. The records don't specify what he did, but it was bad enough to warrant formal charges. Selkirk's response? He didn't show up. He'd already gone to sea. When he came back to Largo in 1701, things got worse. His younger brother laughed at him for accidentally drinking seawater. Selkirk's reaction was to beat him. Then his father and another brother tried to intervene, but he beat them too. The family had to physically restrain him from grabbing his pistol. So we're not talking about some gentle soul who dreamed of adventure. Alexander Selkirk was volatile, quick-tempered, and likely dangerous. The sea wasn't an escape for him. It was the only place that could contain him. In 1703, he joined a privateering expedition led by the famous or infamous William Dampier. Privateers were essentially government-sanctioned pirates. England was at war with Spain during the War of Spanish Succession, and sailors like Selkirk carried letters of marque authorizing them to attack and plunder enemy ships. Selkirk served as sailing master on a vessel called the Cinque Ports, under a young captain named Thomas Stradling. The two men clashed almost immediately. Stradling was only 21, inexperienced, and apparently not well liked by his crew. Selkirk, despite his temper, actually knew ships, and what he saw worried him. The Cinque Ports was rotting. With worm-eaten timbers, it was taking on water. After months of hard sailing around Cape Horn and skirmishes with Spanish and French vessels, Selkirk believed the ship was a death trap waiting to happen. In September 1704, the Cinque Ports anchored at a remote island called Mas a Tierra, part of the Juan Fernandez archipelago, about 400 miles off the coast of Chile. They needed fresh water, repairs, and rest. This is where the confrontation happened. Selkirk told Stradling the ship couldn't continue. He argued for extensive repairs before going any further, but Stradling refused, and the argument escalated. And then Selkirk said something that would define the rest of his life. He declared he would rather stay on this uninhabited island than continue on that ship. Stradling called his bluff. Fine, stay. They gave Selkirk his sea chest, some bedding, a musket with gunpowder and bullets, a hatchet, a knife, a cooking pot, some tobacco, a few navigation instruments, and his Bible. Then they rowed back to the ship. According to every account we have, Selkirk regretted his decision immediately. He waded into the surf, shouting for them to come back. He begged, but Stradling refused, and the ship sailed away. Now, here's where the dramatic irony kicks in, and I want you to hold on to this for the rest of the video. Selkirk was right. The Cinque Ports continued south. The hull kept leaking. Within months, it foundered near a small island off the coast of Colombia. 45 men drowned or died in the aftermath. Captain Stradling and a handful of survivors made it to shore, only to be captured by the Spanish. They were taken to Lima, Peru, where they were interrogated, tortured, and thrown into prison. Stradling actually tried to escape at one point by stealing a canoe. He was recaptured. The survivors spent 4 years rotting in that prison before finally being released. Meanwhile, the man they'd laughed at and left behind, he was still alive. Alone. Yes, but alive. Selkirk's first months alone were brutal. We know this because years later, a journalist named Richard Steele interviewed Selkirk extensively and published the account in a London newspaper called The Englishman. It's one of our best primary sources for what actually happened on that island. Steele wrote that Selkirk was scarce able to refrain from doing himself violence, a polite 18th century way of saying he contemplated suicide. The loneliness was unbearable. He'd been a sailor his whole adult life, always surrounded by other men, always in motion. Now there was nothing but silence, strange sounds from the interior of the island, and the endless crash of waves. He stayed on the beach at first, eating shellfish and lobsters, scanning the horizon every single day for a ship that never came. At night, massive sea lions hauled themselves onto the shore for mating season. Their bellowing was like nothing Selkirk had ever heard. He was terrified to go inland, into the jungle, where he imagined worse things waiting. But eventually, the sea lions forced his hand. They overran his beach, cutting him off from his food supply. He had no choice but to move into the interior of the island. And that's when things started to change. The island's interior turned out to be surprisingly rich. Wild turnips, cabbage, black pepper berries, feral goats, descendants of animals left by earlier Spanish sailors, roamed the hills. Selkirk could hunt them for meat, and eventually learned to catch them alive for milk. He built 2 huts from pimento wood, thatched with grass and lined with goatskins. One served as his kitchen and workspace. The other was for sleeping and his devotions. Every day, Selkirk read from his Bible and recited prayers aloud, not just for spiritual comfort, though that was part of it, but to keep his voice working. The other problem was the rats. Swarms of them, descendants of stowaways from visiting ships, gnawed at his feet and hands while he slept. But Selkirk found an unlikely solution. The island also had feral cats. He tamed some of them, and at night, they'd sleep around him. It's a strange image, this wild-haired castaway surrounded by purring cats in the darkness. But it worked. His gunpowder eventually ran out, so he had to learn to capture goats on foot. And here's where we get one of the most harrowing near misses of his entire ordeal. During one chase, Selkirk pursued a goat up a steep hillside. He lunged to grab it and missed, and both he and the goat tumbled over a cliff. Selkirk landed hard. He lay at the bottom of that ravine, unable to move, for what he later estimated was about 3 days. The goat's body had actually cushioned his fall enough to save his life. If it hadn't been there, he probably would have broken his back. Instead, he just lay there in agony, drifting in and out of consciousness, until he could finally drag himself back to his hut. But the physical dangers weren't the only threat. At one point, Selkirk spotted ships anchoring offshore. His heart must have leapt. Finally, he was rescued. But then he saw the flags. Spanish. If the Spanish captured him, he'd face the same fate as Stradling's crew. Interrogation, torture, years in prison, possibly death. So instead of running to the beach, he ran the other direction, deep into the jungle. The Spanish sailors came ashore looking for fresh water and supplies. A search party spotted Selkirk and fired at him. He scrambled up a tall tree, thick with leaves, and hid in the branches. Eventually, they gave up and returned to their ships. According to Steele's account, something shifted in Selkirk after the first 18 months. The despair began to lift. The constant fear and grief gave way to something else, a kind of peace. Selkirk developed routines, rituals. He'd climb to a high lookout point every day to scan for ships. He sang psalms. He'd grown so healthy from the diet of fresh meat and vegetables, so strong from constantly running after goats, that he later said he was in the best physical condition of his life. The island that had seemed like a prison had become, in some strange way, a kind of paradise. On February 1st, 1709, 4 years and 4 months after he'd been marooned, Selkirk spotted ships on the horizon again. But this time the rigging looked British. His heart pounding, he scrambled down to the beach, built a signal fire, and waved frantically. A landing party rowed ashore, led by a man named Thomas Dover. What they found must have been astonishing. A wild-looking figure dressed entirely in goatskins, his beard grown long and tangled, barefoot with feet so calloused they were like leather. And here's the detail that gets me. Selkirk was so overwhelmed with emotion that he could barely speak. After 4 years of talking only to himself and his cats, he'd almost forgotten how to form words. The ships were the Duke and the Duchess, privateers on a raiding expedition. And in one of history's stranger coincidences, the pilot of the Duke was William Dampier, the same man who'd led the original expedition that Selkirk had joined years earlier. Dampier recognized Selkirk and vouched for him to the captain of the Duke, Woodes Rogers. Rogers's crew was exhausted, sick and unhealthy, with many suffering from scurvy. Selkirk helped them regain their health by catching fresh goats and gathering fresh fruits and vegetables for them. He was agile, fast, and healthy in ways they weren't. Rogers was impressed enough to make him the Duke's second mate. But here's what's often left out of the story. Selkirk didn't want to leave. Multiple accounts suggest that when Selkirk saw Dampier, the man whose expedition had led to his marooning in the first place, he actually asked to be put back ashore. He preferred the island to returning to civilization. But Rogers refused. Selkirk threw himself back into the privateering life, leading raids along the South American coast. The fleet even captured a Manila galleon, one of those legendary Spanish treasure ships, on New Year's Day, 1710. It was only the 4th Manila galleon ever taken by the English in 3 centuries of trying. Selkirk was given command of one of the captured vessels. When he finally returned to England in October 1711, he was wealthy. His share of the plunder came to about £800, roughly equivalent to £150,000 today. He also became famous. Rogers published an account of the voyage, including a detailed description of Selkirk's ordeal. That led the journalist Richard Steele to seek him out for interviews. But wealth and fame didn't make him happy. And this is where Selkirk said something that haunts me. When Steele asked him about his newfound fortune, Selkirk replied, "I am now worth £800, but shall never be as happy as when I was not worth a farthing." Then, in 1719, a writer named Daniel Defoe published a novel called The Life and Strange, Surprising Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. It became an instant sensation, one of the first English novels ever written, and still one of the most famous books in the world. The parallels to Selkirk's story were obvious. A man marooned on a deserted island, survival through ingenuity, goatskin clothing, years of solitude. Readers immediately assumed Crusoe was based on Selkirk. But here's where things get more complicated and more interesting. There's no evidence that Defoe ever met Selkirk, though he definitely knew Woodes Rogers, who'd rescued and written about Selkirk. He'd read Rogers' account, and he'd read Steele's interviews. The material was all there. But modern scholars argue that Robinson Crusoe wasn't based on just one castaway. It was a composite, a literary Frankenstein stitched together from multiple survival stories that were circulating at the time. Remember Will, the Mosquito Indian I mentioned at the beginning? Dampier had written about him in his memoirs, published in the 1690s. Will had survived on the exact same island as Selkirk 20 years earlier. When his rifle ran out of bullets, he'd cut up the metal barrel to make fish hooks and other tools. Some scholars believe Will was actually the primary inspiration for Friday, Crusoe's companion in the novel. Then there's Robert Knox, an English sailor who was shipwrecked on Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, and held captive there for 20 years. That's much closer to the time frame in Crusoe, who spends 28 years on his island. Defoe knew Knox personally. There were others too, Henry Pittman, Pedro Serrano. The point is, Defoe was drawing from a whole tradition of castaway narratives. Selkirk was a major ingredient, probably the main one, but not the only one. And the differences between Selkirk and Crusoe are just as telling as the similarities. Crusoe is shipwrecked by accident. Selkirk chose to be marooned. Crusoe's island is in the Caribbean. Selkirk's was in the Pacific. Crusoe converts a native man to Christianity. Selkirk was completely alone, except for his cats. As for Selkirk, he returned to Lower Largo briefly, where he reportedly built a cave in his parents' backyard and spent hours sitting in it alone. He got into fights and was charged with assault. Eventually, he went back to sea by joining the Royal Navy and serving as master's mate on HMS Weymouth. Ironically, the ship was assigned to anti-piracy patrols off the coast of West Africa, hunting down men who weren't so different from what Selkirk himself had once been. In 1721, yellow fever swept through the crew. Men who'd survived battles and storms died by the dozens from mosquito bites in West African forests. By September, so many were sick that they built a makeshift hospital on shore near Cape Coast Castle. Then, on December 13th, at the age of 45, Alexander Selkirk died. They buried him at sea. This man who survived 4 years alone on a deserted island, who outlived nearly everyone who'd sailed with him on the Cinque Ports, who became one of the most famous castaways in history. In the end, he was just another name in a ship's log, but his story didn't die with him. In 1868, the crew of HMS Topaz placed a bronze plaque at Selkirk's old lookout point, 1,700 feet above the sea where he'd scanned for rescue ships every day for 4 years. In a strange coincidence, the man who installed the tablet was named Dampier, though no relation to the original William Dampier. In 1966, the Chilean government renamed Maz a Tierra as Robinson Crusoe Island to attract tourists. The larger neighboring island, which Selkirk never actually set foot on, they named Alejandro Selkirk Island. There's something fitting about that. His name attached to a place he never saw, just as Crusoe's story overshadowed his own. In 2005, archaeologists excavating the island found a fragment of copper navigational dividers from the early 18th century. Almost certainly Selkirk's, one of the few physical traces of a man who otherwise left nothing behind but stories. And then there's this. Selkirk may have kept a diary during his time on the island. Some researchers believe it is in the State Library of Prussian Cultural Heritage in Berlin. Its very existence is disputed. If it's real, it's been sitting there for centuries, untranslated and unstudied. You might say it is marooned there, just like its author once was. That's the real story of Alexander Selkirk. Not a tale of simple survival, but of a troubled man who found peace in solitude and then lost it again when he returned to the world. He was right about the ship. He was right about the danger. And maybe in the end, he was right that he should have stayed on that island. If this kind of deep dive into the facts behind the stories, Let us know in the comments which stories you would like us to research.